Okay, hello, Lucas. Lucas Preuth. You took my Path of the Polyglot course for the first cycle that went through, and you've been studying in Japan or whatnot. It's been good to see you again. What have you been up to?
Yes, good to see you as well, Professor Arguelles. It's been a second, hasn't it?
Mm.
Lately, I have been studying Mongolian. This has been
Ah.
my current project recently. It's been a lot of fun. I think the
Mm-hmm.
last time we spoke, you knew a little bit about me looking into Turkish.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think sometimes we find ourselves, honestly, just following paths we didn't expect to follow. And Mongolian just absolutely took me by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
I'm loving the language and its similarities to Turkish and Japanese and its phonology, its grammar.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very fascinating language. So this has been sort of my project recently. I've been learning this
Wonderful.
and mhm,
Mhm. No, I can see that you're going to go in that direction. I mean, you've got Japanese under your
yep,
belt, and again, there are people who really find similarities between. When I did Finnish, found it very similar to Korean grammar, and I've known Koreans
yeah.
who found Turkish and even Quechua. So I think there's a certain, apart from language family, there's a certain similarity, a structural similarity to languages that sometimes cut across boundaries. And I think that's a fascinating thing to explore. So I think you're a good person to explore it. What else you got going?
Yeah, well, that's pretty much, I think at the moment I'm doing a lot of French as well,
Hmm.
so I'm trying to revive my French.
Hmm.
And I think all of last year I spent a very intensive period learning Japanese, upwards to 6, 7, 8 hours a day. And that has actually provided the discipline that I needed, I think, to really begin following a very structured path of acquiring multiple languages and finding sort of the methods and the tools through which I can do that.
Great.
So this year as well, I have some plans as well to maybe start Russian in
Mhm.
June. I might do that with my twin brother. We're
Mhm.
thinking about doing that as sort of a project together. And I'm also thinking about I'm re enlivening my French, and I'm also looking at Dutch and Danish since I already have German and Low Saxon as languages that I think I can find the time to begin seeding into my study routine, so that by
Mhm.
the end of the year I have really this plentiful bounty of languages which I can engage with daily.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I tried to give you sort of the best of sort of systematic structural framework that I could in my manuscript of the Path of the Polyglot. You took that whole sequence and
I did, yeah.
everybody has follow-up questions. I've taken my manuscript from there. I'm going to have a follow-up to that. I don't know what I'll call it yet, but there'll be like a second stage. But what can I do for you today? What questions do you have? What should we talk about?
Great, yeah. So regarding actually the path of the polyglot, and I'm sure you may remember some of my questions during that course as being particularly pesky. I don't know, I tend to ask the same questions over and over, but really my questions are concerning this. And this is the textbook. This is happens to be the Routledge Colloquial Series. And
Hmm.
my question concerns sort of how to most effectively use this textbook. And I have about 3 or 4 questions that I kind of want to get some input from you on. I've asked these questions before in Path to the Polyglot, but sort of
Hmm.
going through this again, it's been a long time since I've opened a textbook like this, since my other languages were either advanced or I used a digital tools or an immersion-based approach. That's something that we can leave for later. I know you've talked about that with Robbie in the past. Um,
Hmm.
but this is interesting because these textbooks, I think you're very well familiar with them. You have an entire digital library, or
Yes.
you have a very
Mhm.
a physical library of these books.
Yeah.
And I think this is the key, right, to a language. Whenever you first approach a new language, this
Hmm.
is the kind of thing that you need to study. And this is where I think most learners fail. This basically makes or breaks the learning stage. You get through this successfully, you can then begin using other materials, or you find these dialogues too hard, you're not able to correctly parse them, or you don't have the consistency, what have you. You put it back down and you never touch the language again. So I think that's a
Hmm.
story a lot of us sort of have experienced or have heard tale of. So I just
Hmm.
have a few questions considering this, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, sure. Don't mind at all.
Right. So
And
my first
if-
one, oh, go ahead.
no, no, I was just going to say you were right. I do. There was a time
Mhm.
when I had all my root colloquials together, and then I separated them out by language. But yeah, a very, very
Yeah.
thorough series. I'm sorry. First question. Yeah.
Right. So my first question regards the actual um let's call it the actual process of learning. So going through the dialogues, a lot of these series are dialogue-based course books.
Hmm.
I know you advocate for Assamese. In this
Hmm.
case, for Mongolian, there's very few
Hmm.
resources. There might be an Assamese Mongolian. I'm not aware of it. It might be in French. I might not be able to read it. So
Hmm.
this is, I'm sticking with the colloquial for now. Um, and the dialogues in this book can become quite challenging. So I'm currently on chapter 5. It's 10 chapters in total.
Hmm.
And the dialogues in chapter 5 begin getting so intense where we start seeing subordinate clauses and embedded clauses with indirect speech and grammar forms that have been introduced in prior chapters that maybe haven't yet been mastered. And so this is my sort of my question for you. I find this to be a really resource intensive process going through these dialogues. And I know in the past that you have and in Path of the Polyglot, we've talked about certain techniques to parse these. And you talk a lot about global understanding, this sort of
Hmm.
using two dialogues, so your target language and translation in tandem to reach sort of a global understanding. And I have found that that has almost entirely not worked for me. And so I sort of want advice regarding this. I found that the approach that has worked the best for me to facilitate learning has been a much more analytical one, which is, do I know every single part, stem, grammatical inflection, etc., morphological ending of a word that's being presented to me, and can I parse that in spoken speech? And this
Hmm.
is very labor intensive in a lot of ways, and it can be very it can be very unencouraging, unmotivating when I feel like I'm not understanding after, 10 or 15 reviews of the same dialogue, or maybe I'm searching in the back the glossary for a word or an inflection or something that I can't remember or didn't write down. So I'm curious if you've had any experience with this, what your thoughts on this might be, or if you could elaborate.
Okay.
How might
Well,
I go about solving this?
mhm. First of all, as you said, I mean, to be an analytical learner, learning styles, an analytical learner, yes, very much profits from the in what you're as you started talking about the book. Yes, there, if you can get a structural foundation, then you can build upon it. And some people like to think, well, somehow I can just sort of start talking naturally, and maybe some people can, but people with analytical minds need that firm structural foundation. And we are conditioned to think, well, I'd have to understand everything before I move on. And depending on the structure of the book, that may or may not be true. And if that is true, then that's what you need to do. If it isn't, if it's a habit, if that works for you, that's fine. You can keep doing it. But it risks sometimes being overkill. As you said, it's a bit labor intensive. It's a bit, you get in to parse everything. Do you really need to parse everything all the time? If you didn't parse everything all the time, you parse the things that you needed, then you would have more time for doing other things. So I think that to use the book in front of me, but like I said, I'm very familiar with the series. It's a book like that. I often, when I really work with colloquial books or some more the modern teach yourself books, the dialogue things that you're getting, the kind of the book that you have there. I did a lot of physically cutting, either cutting and pasting, photocopying the dialogues, cutting and pasting. I think there you can sort of make them more like an essay. Like you said, it didn't really work that well for you. But you could put the dialogues together. You could. It's very important to me to turn it into something that you can do more shadowing with. The audio that comes with those courses is really, get some English instruction, English encouraging, do this. So it really helps to edit the instructional language, the English, out of the audio, and then you're left with entirely the narrative flow. And if you also the book to be that way or cut and paste it, then you have something more akin to something just straight looking at. And I think you could take that in either way. Could take that and say, well, I am going to go for a global understanding. And I'm going to make a point of each time I read this, I'm going to look up one more word. Each time I read this, I should get something more from the act of familiarity with it, but I'll also allow myself to look up an extra word. And so each time you exercise, hopefully in greater understanding and hope avoid that frustration. You think when you say I don't mean anything, because you're not setting yourself up to expect that you're going to understand everything. You want to understand
Mhm.
a little bit more each time. And then, as we talked before, then the secret is finding some rhythm whereby you continually review, not continually, but you stagger something like an 80-20 rule, you want to do about 20% new material when you look at an 80%, review of stuff that you looked at before. And if you do,
Mm,
that's how you'll go back and you say, and then when you get more advanced, you said less than 5, I don't know how long that is. When you get more advanced, then you sort of have to do your own sort of spaced repetition in what you're going to review. And if you get in a habit, feeling free to sort of make larger photocopies of the pen next to the Mongolian, things that you don't understand, write a question mark in pencil. And then when you come back and you're saying, well, I'm not reviewing this lesson anymore, I still don't understand this, but after you look, after you've gone a couple more lessons, when you review this one again, I bet you'll find that most of those question marks have resolved themselves, that you didn't need to sit and do them mentally. And the ones that remain, those are the ones that you say, okay, now's the time to get my reference dictionary out. Now's the time to ask somebody. Now's the time to look in, because these are the ones that are really thorny. So I'm not wasting my time and energy getting things that I would get by familiarity with, so building my pronunciation by shadowing more, reading it more. I'm getting the things by osmosis that I can get, by repetition, and then I'm saving my energy for analysis for the things that are really hard.
that's that's phenomenal advice. Yeah, actually, I think it was that 80-20 rule that I've probably been ignoring. I think I was a little focused. You've called me impatient in the past. I think I was a little focused on trudging along as fast as possible. And the first three lessons are relatively easy, but then the fourth and the fifth is suddenly building on knowledge that perhaps I don't quite have. You made a
Mm-hmm.
really good point
It's
about,
if I may just put something,
yeah,
I
please.
mean, I'm not going to adhere to an 80-20 rule, but there's something like it depends on the language and your familiarity that you learned before. So you've got a good foundation in Germanic languages. When another Germanic language, I wouldn't say an 80-20. Somebody like you, maybe
Sure.
60-40 rule. You could do 60%, but you always want to, I'd say with anything that you're trying to learn, you want to do, more review than new. Okay. So at least some sort of,
Yeah.
so maybe, 66-33 or 75-25, but for a really hard language, like Mongolian, if need be, if it gets a really hard language, you can make it 10% and 90%. It depends on, the language and your familiarity.
Yeah. That's
Okay.
great.
Sorry.
So no, I wanted to touch on, so one thing you said was you mentioned that sort of pasting that you did with the colloquial books. And I have been, I don't know how well you can see this, but I have been doing something very similar where I
Mm,
basically go line by line. Usually this is my way of parsing the information.
mhm,
And I parse new information in Blue and English. I don't add the exact translation as they provide in the book, but I do go basically line by line and write all the new words, new grammar, any endings that I might not understand, things like that. And then this works as a great sort of form of review for me. But what can be frustrating is that it still feels like there's some kind of disconnect. It still feels like sometimes I might be going through a dialogue and I might be writing this out and I might still
mhm.
not understand. But from what I'm understanding, your advice is simply to just leave it alone, to continue reviewing, and then eventually this will resolve itself.
Yeah. And then, as you said, and I recall in the class now, yes, you are comprehensively impatient. It's understandable that you want to get somewhere fast, but you're still very young and you haven't lived the experience of sort of learning a language over a longer period of time and realizing it's a really continuous process, and languages take longer times to grow. I think you get more satisfactory results. I mean, most people are always very in a hurry. I want to know this now and try to cram it in. And if you could plan it more, say my goal is eventually I want to know all these languages. And so I'm going to work towards that long-term goal. And if I think you were to grow a language slowly over time, I think by the time you get there, you'll have a much more firm and wide and broad foundation in it. Try to cram it in and just live it.
Mhm. That's great. Um, so my next question regards still the dialogues, but this time the shadowing process. I think shadowing
Mhm.
is a really interesting concept, and it is something that I had hitherto, before taking your class, never applied. Uh, Miraculously, somehow, the technique has been popularized online for several years, but I just never got around to doing it. We did demonstrations in your class. I found them really quite powerful, so then I decided to actually employ it in my own learning. And I have found, I will say, admittedly, great success in something as, mundane as my own German, which has already been
Mhm.
quite good, and Japanese. So I am quite a big fan of the shadowing now. I'm sure you might be
Mhm.
glad to hear that. But regarding the
I am
dialogues,
glad. Mhm.
yeah, regarding these dialogues, Mongolian has some very difficult sounds. It's a very consonant heavy language, and I often feel sometimes that my shadowing sounds a lot more like gibberish or baby prattle than it is true shadowing of the language. And so perhaps instead of making words, I'm making noises. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to this a little bit, if you've had any experience with this, and how might you balance shadowing with, say, something like active listening, or use it in conjunction,
Mhm.
or even avoid using it at all if you find that whatever sounds are coming from your mouth are not remotely like that of your target language. Is that dangerous? Is that bad? Should we be doing more listening, or should we keep shadowing?
Mhm. Okay. I don't, okay, where to start? Um, so I guess the basic recommendation is just again slow things down. We literally do by slowing down something, changing the tone, changing the speed to make it easier when you're getting to particularly hard sections. Also, shadowing is great, but when you find certain particular words, certain sound combinations. I mean, we were just doing Koine Greek with another group, and there are certain just sound combinations that really trip up the tongue. We have these forms. Anything in your copy of dialogue, well, again, underline or highlight those, and then shadow, but just, phonetically, syllable by syllable, reading that slowly, 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 putting it together, making it a tongue twister. And, if it's important to you, you just need to practice it a lot, and the same thing to get better. So these sound combinations, so slow it down, the phonetic things that you really get, slow down the things that you're listening to. But I wouldn't say, again, my experience with shadowing is that if you're really making gibberish, then you're not. I guess you're not. It's kind of not possible to, how to put it. You're listening to the sound come in, and you're making a
Mhm.
sound that's so gibberish like you will not be able to hear the next sound at all, so that you'll have to stop. But if you're keeping making gibberish, that means that your ear is somehow perceiving the sound that you're hearing, and the sound that you're making is acceptable enough that it doesn't block out the next sound.
Mhm.
So if you're really doing it wrong, you'll come to a crashing halt and you have to stop. If you're continuing to make sounds, it might sound like, it's not very good, not gibberish, but if you can put that in conjunction with really understanding the phonetics of the language and putting it down into syllables and practicing the hard parts and all things together, again, with time, that will come.
Mhm. Yeah, I suppose you're right on the nose about that. A lot of my shadowing does come to a halt. There's some times where it flows quite nicely, especially with some dialogues that I've already reviewed, already learned. But then with some newer dialogues, especially because in the colloquial series, at least, the dialogue tends to be very fast, or at least for this textbook, to the point
Mhm.
where sometimes I find myself completely frozen, and sentences will fly by, and I'll get three
Mhm.
syllables, and that's it. And
Mhm.
that's a little bit discouraging.
Mhm. Well, um, again, if have you tried literally? I've made a video once about using this program called Audacity, where you put a sound file in and you can slow it down or speed it up, change the tone, change the speed. Have you ever tried?
I'm familiar with Audacity, but no, I actually have not tried
Give that
editing
a
this.
try. If you say this is very fast, if you say this is very fast, again, slow it down. At a certain point, some recordings will get distorted, but you'd be amazed at how much you can slow down, or some recordings are too slow, how much you can speed up without distorting things. And it, just like, I don't know, practicing music at different speeds sometimes is part of the practice. So um, I think there's nothing, if there's parts that you find really hard, if you just apply all those things, really slow down the speed and the tone of the recording. Uh, Take the words that are hard, break them up, practice those separately, and yeah, do it. Yeah, again, you can also truly, if you find this hard, again with that same program, cut it or paste it, break it, take that sentence that you find hard and put it 10 times in a row. Okay, and if you do something 10 times in a row, then hopefully you'll get better. And if if you nothing like this works, then it's a really hard language. You got to challenge and you got to go there and do something else, you know?
Right. Great. Okay. So using digital tools perhaps is one way that we can go about solving that. That's good
Mhm.
to know. Yeah. I guess using the textbook and all textbook and paper, I wasn't thinking about perhaps using any kind of technological assistance, but I can see the benefit of it.
Well, I wouldn't stay again. I wouldn't stay in front of the computer doing that. But if you
Hmm.
want to stay with paper, definitely you'll learn much better. If you're, take, we use this to communicate. It's great, but you want to do, you want your main mind focused and not distracted. It's just so much easier that way. So no, I wouldn't say stay doing this ones, but you can make whatever files and download them and listen to them. But not in front
Hmm.
of the computer though.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Great. Well, I have just two more questions if you'll entertain them. My
I'll go back
third,
and say, what you do is you could also go and you could go to an antique store and you could get a cassette tape player and you could make a cassette tape of this. And then you could, on the dual thing, you could cut and paste
yeah.
and do this and record. That's the way I did it.
Well,
And I
I
found all
suppose you
that
made the
labor
best of
and
it.
yeah. Yeah, I found that labor-intensive work was not wasted because you have to pay so much attention to making a good job and you're listening and you're watching it, and even cutting up the book and and doing a series of that, become familiar with the entire. It's like doing a pre-reading and you know what's in the text and and you're sort of taking command of the learning. And the same thing with the audio.
Mhm.
So yeah, I do find that the content, sometimes a language like Mongolian, this is the only book you have. This time might not, but if you can always modify it and make it more usable.
That's great. Yeah, I think flexibility um, is something that the
Mhm.
learner needs to keep in mind, myself included. That's great. Yeah, so I have two more questions. This third question is going to be regard output practice using the textbook. So now, as I'm sure you're aware, textbooks don't take you to a necessarily very high level. Um, let's
Mhm.
say perhaps A2, B1, depending on how well it's structured, how well it's written, etc., how many number of words that it might teach. And in a lot of these dialogues, there will be sort of guided output sections, whether that be an L1 to L2 translation, translation from target language into your own native language or learning language, close deletions, or say modifying or point out what's wrong with a particular grammar in a sentence, or attaching the correct grammatical ending to something. So these kinds of exercises you'll find very often, especially I found in the older books, even from the 20th century. There's a lot of this stuff. Have you used these in your own learning with textbooks? Do you tend to use them often? Is that something you want to review and go over and over? Do you simply skip them? Or what kind of value do you see in this?
So exercises that are like, that are full sentences at least, or, comprise some sort of a paragraph or some sort of a narrative, are one thing. You can take those and review those profitably. Exercises that are truly teaching, drilling a certain grammatical point, here's the, subjunctive, and you've got to you have to take the right. If you have hard time doing that, that's worth doing an exercise like that multiple times when you do different reviews. But honestly, most exercises in most books like this here, depending on the type of exercise, it doesn't really seem worth doing at all, some of them. And some of them seem, okay, well, I'll do it once, but I don't need to do this again when I review it, the sort of mixing and matching. But again, I think that might be a question of learning styles, the type of exercises in there that try to give variety. So I wouldn't say there's a general rule, but for me, I would like to select out the texts that have more of a narrative feel, and those are the ones that you can sort of profitably review with the same style that I mentioned before. Was there a second part to that question?
Well, I suppose the second part has to do maybe with my own feeling towards the exercise. I was first sort of asking about how you've used them in the past, and sort of the reason I'm asking this question is in my own experience, I've used them very seldom. I found them to be really quite frustrating,
Mhm.
insofar as I feel like that I can get more out of spending more time with a dialogue than I can going line by line trying to translate something. Um, But I think during that experience, during the time that I take trying to use these output exercises, I tend to find that to be frustrating, and that's demotivating for me. So this might just be a learner specific issue on my end, but I often find myself wanting to skip them. I don't know if that skipping them then is sort of a sort of negligence on my ability to output later, though.
Well, unfortunately for your love of Mongolian, yours is a case when you might have to force yourself to do these kind of things, find tedious because there aren't a lot of resources. So when you're working
Hmm.
with the only textbook for something, you just have to suck it up and you can say like, oh, this is not
Hmm.
my learning style. I would rather not do this, but this is what I have. And this is, if I get a solid foundation by doing this, then I will, then I'll be able to somehow go on to use other kinds of material more profitably. I think find something, if you're in that situation, you find it really tedious, really like the material, that's when I would really encourage people to, um, what did you say? You were doing 6 or 7 hours a day of Japanese?
Yeah, quite
So that's a
intensely.
really advanced level, reading and immerse, but a language like Mongolian, how much time can you get into it a day?
Recently it's probably about 90 minutes to maybe 3 hours, and that includes preparing material for the next day to study.
Yes, that's what you need to learn a language like that. So between an hour and a half and 3 hours a day. But how are you breaking that time up?
At the
In
moment
15-minute
it's
chunks and 30 all
yeah,
together?
they're usually about 45-minute chunks really. So usually I'm doing review of prior dialogues plus working on the new dialogue, and that's about a 45-minute chunk to an hour. So
Hmm.
whatever stage I'm at in working on a new dialogue, whether that be output exercises or scriptorium or what have you. And then I create Anki cards for the old dialogues for vocab, which is going to be sort of my fourth question we can get to later. But I find, especially because Mongolian is unrelated to any hitherto learned language, I find that the vocab acquisition is quite hard and needs its own time.
Hmm.
So I spend time creating those cards. And then usually in the latter half of the day, I do really easy reading, sort of light reading. I currently have a copy of the Little Prince that I'm going through, and I go line by line, sort of almost in a
In
digital
Mongolian,
sphere.
the Little Prince in
In
Mongolian?
yeah, that's correct. In written in Cyrillic.
Mm.
Um, s- so I
Okay.
have a copy of that, and I go line by line with a translation by side, and I see how much of it I can understand. This might not be the most facilitative exercise for learning, but it is something that's quite fun for me, and I do learn new words, and I do reinforce inflections this way.
Okay. Again, with had more resources, I would say, well, hold off on something like Little Prince. That's a lot harder. But for motivating yourself, for giving yourself self-interest, you're already very much on the right track, saying, trying to do a different variety and not sticking with one thing. But back to the point of finding this, that's the only resource I have, and I find this kind of exercise so demotivating as tedious as to be demotivating. Um, I think the trick there is to just really break that into the tiniest bite-sized chunks that you can handle, and tag them onto something else. If you one of those Anki people, you like doing this many cards, and you then do one of these exercises, just sort of, you know, get it in, get it done. If it's the kind of exercise can be done that way. But again, if there are no other resources, I think just saying, okay, keeping your reasons for staying ahead and saying, I can take a little bit of pain gain, if I have to put this in.
Yeah, I think that's great, actually. What I'll probably do, heeding your advice, is maybe forcing myself 1 to 2 output exercises a day onto one other task. That way, it doesn't feel like I'm sitting here and I'm spending 30 minutes and only really getting 10 minutes or less of work done because I'm spending most of the time upset or frustrated with my inability to enjoy the process.
Doing it. Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Great. Well, this has been really this has been very useful so far, so I appreciate you taking the time. My last question is
Okay.
just actually that, which regards vocab acquisition. And this might be more of a grander question that goes beyond just my own learning, sort of more um, trying to understand from your side how you have always tackled vocab acquisition. This is something I've asked in Path of the Polyglot as well, because it is something that I have found almost very mysterious about your own learning, at least from what I've heard of, and read about it. in that I find vocab acquisition on my end to be extraordinarily important to make sure that I'm
Hmm.
constantly improving in my language. So for me, a lot of my language skills are very directly correlated to how many words do I know in a language, even if that's sort of a number that's just random. Like I don't have exact statistics on how many numbers how many words I know in each language, but if I can translate it consciously, then that means I can facilitate conversation or communication a little bit easier. Um, and so that means taking the time out of my day to study just vocab. And this could be context-based learning, whether that means like I take independent sentences from a dialogue where I look for exactly one word that I want to learn from that sentence, or that could be straight vocab acquisition, where I take something like a word list from the Mongolian textbook and say, okay, like, that means cloud, right? And I want to learn that, and I'm going to make a flashcard, and I'm going to test my rote memorization of that. And then I do this extensively, and I aim, in my example, I aim for 15 new words a day. How do
Hmm.
you go about doing this? Is this ever something that you've engaged in? Do you, because for me, this is sort of one of the core aspects of if I ignore, I don't feel like I'm making progress because too much of my time is spent wondering what that word is or what is this I don't understand.
Hmm. Um, I don't know what to say, but I honestly think that if other people didn't talk about vocabulary acquisition, it's just not a concept that would ever have occurred to me. That
Hmm.
I need to acquire vocabulary. I'm curious to learn the language, so the words are an integral part of the language. Just sort of, no, I've never engaged in that of like my own druthers, but I'd be curious to see how different types of things work. And so before Anki, there were flashcards that you had, in a box. And so I tried some of those, and there was this vocabulary type things, which just have sometimes it was themed, sometimes not, just say the word back and sort of sometimes just adjectives together, or sometimes various things in various languages. That's what I found really tedious and unnecessary. It was not just tedious, it's like, well, I just don't see the point of this.
Hmm.
By If you have a good grammar translation method, or they've got the vocabulary that you need in that chapter. And so if you do that chapter and you do those exercises and you translate those, and same thing, you might not have a recording for an older book or something. You can still make, when you have a nice clean, you should keep a separate notebook for write out, maybe doing the exercises that are worth repeating if you're going to get straight sentences to read out or a narrative. Um, that kind of thing would be worth doing well. And then writing nicely and clearly in a separate book so that you continue to sort of read that book as something that you're building. And if you keep rereading the sentences, if you see the vocabulary in the list, read the sentence, the next time you read the sentence, it said my internet was on, so I want to,
Yeah.
this will be edited. I was saying, if you do the exercises, okay, and when you do that, you use the vocabulary list to the translation, and then you understand the translation, you reread the sentence, you'll be reviewing the word. And if you do that each time, you're seeing the word in the context. To take the word separately and try to learn it as a separate word, I just never did that.
Yeah. Well, that's so fascinating to me too, because a lot of the techniques that I've inherited and experimented have been from other polyglots that have experimented with different techniques about vocab acquisition. So I always find it quite mysterious that you're able to do this. I find vocab acquisition to be honestly quite hard. I find it to be quite challenging and to be sort of one of the primary methods through which I continue improving my languages. Like for Japanese, as well, I try and challenge myself to find 20 new words a day. And
Mm-hmm.
without that sort of challenge, I don't find my learning to be as productive. Perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like maybe you have some sort of built-in system, maybe where this vocabulary acquisition is happening at an unconscious level.
I might, in all honesty, and that's one reason I hope, see you in person sometime, and I hope to have, some sort of workshop, a week at a time, because there's just things that I can't explain or teach because I'm not really aware of them myself. I think we talked about
Mhm.
this that the video out there of that I was working with a Russian professor who wanted to see how I studied, and she made a presentation about that, and she observed all sorts of things that I was aware of that I did. So like if you and I were to, study like languages side by side, you could, say, hey, what are you doing? Maybe you could ask or
Yeah.
observe, and then I could that is a kind of research. People do participant or observation research or something like that, where you actually, engage and ask questions. And I could yeah, just watch them do certain things like shouting and say, well, just stand up straight, and open your thorax. Whoa, heavy words are coming out, and then like gibberish. It sounds clear. Physical hands-on touch that might be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. Another thing that really helps, it would be possible everywhere, but if you have any um, etymological explanations for the vocabulary, any sort of
Right.
root book
Yeah.
when you learn Russian, wonderful book of Russian verbs, and for Turkish, I think I showed you this, that wonderful
Yeah.
Turkish verb. So if you understand the meaning of the words, and that that helps you remember it too. Maybe that might be a sort of mnemonic device that I do sort of without knowing, somehow catch some sort of word and remember it that way. I have always found that languages that have a lot of words that sound like they mean what they do mean, even though I don't know that. Even though it's not in their languages, it just it's really hard to remember that word because it doesn't sound like it means what it means. It sounds
Yeah.
somehow it doesn't. There's a feeling, there's an intuitive feeling that you get, and I don't know. Maybe you can hone that sense of feeling. Maybe with practice of doing different types of languages, you can get better at that. But yeah.
I certainly think you can. Yeah, I my experience with that has been pretty similar insofar as with learning Japanese. I very intensively learned words for a very long time, and for a while I was doing 50 new words a day. And during that time period, I would say for the first 3 to 4 months, those words felt sort of like gibberish insofar as they weren't palpable in a way that now
Mhm.
they are. And perhaps that's just a closer contact to the language, a wider breadth of context in which they can be situated. I'm not sure, but now I come across a new word and it certainly has that feeling like it's a real word and it's something that can belong to me and that I can use and that exists in the world. Whereas something like
Mhm.
Mongolian, and perhaps just because of my own ignorance or my own lack of contact with that language, its people, culture, etc., those words feel very foreign, very distant, and so they're much harder and require a lot more review. Otherwise, if I go through the dialogues, they just won't stick.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep. Yeah, and again, when you get the learning stage is one thing, but you get more familiar with the language, you'll have that sensation even more. You will start to intuit things. For example, when I
Mhm.
was teaching in Korea, at first, Korean names were a total enigma to me, and I didn't know, what who was what. And then after a certain time, all of a sudden, boom, you can just tell that's a girl's name, that's a boy's name. They have a certain feel to it, and there's some that overlap, there's some different, but you could just sort of, without knowing it, there's just certain things that sound right, and it's like, all of a sudden, yeah, I'm right. You have that experience too when you'll have it, or you have had it when you live in the country and you um, go out and about in the town to do some take care of some business, and you come and you realize you took care of the business, and you say, now, what was the word for that? I don't know. I somehow I've done that. You go to the bank, you
Yeah.
exchange money, you do this, and it's like, I don't know how to say those words, but you get into the context and you can somehow elicit, and you hear what their people are saying, and you mirror it back to them, and that's how communication works. I mean, it really is making the right sounds at the right time, and having that perceived. And if you can somehow get onto the wavelength of the communication, you can be along by paying attention to what the other person is saying and using it back. So, again,
Hmm.
maybe be an answer there to be that sort of active use if you could find some way to do that.
Yeah. I think I think it's a phenomenal explanation. It actually reminds me of a essay I read by Heinrich von Kleist. I don't know if you know him or if you've read anything from him, but
Oh
there's
yeah,
a
his
beautiful
great choice.
Yeah, he has a beautiful essay called Über die allmähliche Verfertigung der Gedanken beim Reden. So, over the slow, gradual development of thoughts through speaking. And
Hmm.
yeah, I think eventually context and communication allows us to internalize a lot of the parts of the language learning that
Hmm.
at first feels very foreign and feels very forced, but over time, I think becomes very enlivened. Yeah.
Good. Okay,
Well, that
well,
answers the
those
bulk
are all
of
your
my
questions.
questions. Yeah. Sorry, I cut
Yeah.
you off there,
How
but that
you?
answers
How's
the.
Nicholas? What's he up to?
Oh, he's great. He's currently studying for
Yeah.
the LSAT, and he's thinking about going to law school. And he's
Hmm.
excited to return to the world of language study post uh, taking that exam. And like I said, we have this sort of project that we're both very interested in Russian, and we want to tackle that together. So to this time point, we have learned languages but can't speak with each other, which is kind of funny. Well, I'm working on my French, he's working on his German, but they're both, not as high as
Hmm.
they really should be. So
Yeah. For anybody who's still watching this lengthy interview to the end, it wasn't just a courtesy ask. It's a very interesting phenomenon of people who want to study language learning, language enthusiasm, to have two identical twin brothers who are interested in the same thing and doing various things. So they would be good guinea pigs for some sort of test to see which method is actually best to work on something. Put you in a cell and make you learn Mongolian by next week and see which of you gets there first. That would be kind of
that
interesting.
certainly would be interesting. I can only hope that I'd come out the victor. I don't think anyone wants to be the losing party.
No, no. But if you came into the world, you came in about 5 minutes earlier, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so you'll get there 5 minutes
I
earlier.
was I
So
was the firstborn, so
yeah, but he's only 5 minutes behind, and so he'll be there. So okay, well, I hope that was answered your question. I think we had some sound there and that answered most everything. So any enough?
yeah. That no, that was great. It answered all the questions I have, sort of, I mean, geared towards me, but I really hope this can be useful for other people as well, because I really do think that this sort of the physical textbook, in a lot of ways, is the embodiment of what sort of language learning looks like. It's sort of the it's like a microcosm almost, because if you can get through this textbook, you're prepared to approach the world at large, the language in a deeper capacity. But I think a lot of learners fail to get through this, and myself included. There's a lot of textbooks that I put down, like the Turkish one, and I don't know Turkish. So finding the strategies to best go through this, I think, are really important. So
Okay, well, hope you have a few more of them now after this talk.
yeah, thank you so much.